All right, thanks, Eric.
Yep.
Thanks, Eric. My name is Holly Jones. I'm here with Michelle McKinnon and Liz Mamer. And this semester, we've been working on the initial mapping of the borough of the Bronx for the Welikia project. So to start, I'd like to briefly refresh your Bronx geography. I'll try to collapse the whole borough into about a minute and a half. Down here is Manhattan Island, and if you follow that north, you'll see an area called Spite and Divel. And that was a very notorious little creek, 17th century Dutch for in spite of the devil. And some projects to realign it and fill it in at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, caused a weird neighborhood shift between Manhattan and the Bronx. And that's why Marble Hill is part of the Bronx and why the top of Inwood is part of Manhattan. And just north of there, Van Cortlandt Park. It's beautiful, and in fact, some of the billion-year-old Fordham gneiss that forms most of the bedrock of the Bronx can be seen in some huge outcroppings up there. This green swath in the middle of the Bronx Park is home to the New York Botanical Garden. I highly recommend checking out the Wigwam, and also the Bronx Zoo. And to the northeast of there, Pelham Bay Park is one of the areas that interests us the most. We'll show you later on that you can really see how the borough has expanded and filled in over what was originally there. And just south of there, just east, City Island. It's a residential island, has about 4,500 residents. And unfortunately, you cannot see it on this image. I'm disappointed. But just to the east of City Island is its very spooky neighbor called Hart Island. There's no public access. No one lives there, but it is a public cemetery. And down at the very bottom here, you see these two river mouths that meet the East River. The one to the east is Westchester Creek, and to the left of that is the Bronx River, and that's one of the most important features that we've dealt with. It's a natural dividing line between the eastern and western parts of the borough, and the geography to the west is much hillier, and to the right it's much flatter. And it also served as an important designation really for every stage of the borough's history. And what we found was that they really existed as separate entities for most of their time. The western part of the Bronx was annexed about 20 years earlier to the city of New York than the east. And for that reason, most of our maps only show one half or another. And so as we try to get a comprehensive composite of the whole borough, that's the area that gives us the most trouble, is right along the river where the boundary is a bit indistinct. So the question I get asked when I'm sitting on the subway with my laptop open, furiously digitizing in ArcGIS is, well, why does it matter where a river or a tree was 400 years ago? And I think there's some very immediate practical benefits to knowing what the landscape would do if we weren't tinkering with it. One of the first problems that always comes to my mind is the stormwater runoff in New York City. And if we had a better understanding of the natural waterways and hydrology in the Bronx, that might help lead to some better solutions. And also, very important as we restore degraded areas and brownfields in the Bronx, the better picture we have of what was living there beforehand, the better chance we'll have of choosing the species that will thrive best and also return those ecosystem services we care about the most. And one of the greatest things about this project is that it's really a great stepping stone for changing some attitudes about nature in the city. And what's exciting is Welikia it's an expansion of Manhattan that was driven by New Yorkers' interests. They wanted the same product, the same information about these other boroughs. And we think that getting people to understand that we're a part of nature and there's potential for it to come back, even though we've covered everything with impervious surface, it's really key to generating interest and implementation of some greener technologies.
So I'm just going to briefly go over the process that all groups went through to get these maps and then digitize them. So first we searched for the maps and we went to New York Public Library, New York Historical Society, and specific offices within the borough. So for us that was the Bronx Borough President Topographical Bureau. And then we tried to find maps that were between the 1700s and 1900s. And we looked for, good scan quality, good detail, and preferably the older maps. And then there were already some maps that we had in the database, so we each chose 2 maps to georeference. And so our next step was georeferencing these maps. And we used a program called ArcGIS, which Holly mentioned. And we overlaid the modern-day Bronx on top of these historical images. And we got the modern-day Bronx from New York City's Department of City Planning, and it had the shore outline and then the streets. And so in order to georeference this, we found recognizable points on the historical maps and picked those out and then aligned them with modern day points. So if there was maybe a cross street that was around in the late 1900s, we'd point that out and then find it where it is today and match it along with that. And after a while, the map would begin matching up within the program. And then we wanted to digitize features, so we marked where certain topographical features were on the map. So rivers, ponds, wetlands, beaches, and the shoreline. And we traced them out. For the rivers, we used like line segments and just drew them in the actual program. And then for like wetlands and ponds, we would trace them with polygons, and we would label them in a table, either saltwater, freshwater, or the order of the stream. And then finally, we synthesized these features. So we had 6 maps, we brought them all together, and since some of the maps overlapped, the features overlapped as well. So there's a process of picking out which features from which map we wanted to use. And Michelle's later going to talk about the process that we went through. And then to go over a few of the maps that we used. This is Skinner and Taylor, or Andrew Skinner and George Taylor. It's from 1781. It's our oldest map by about 100 years, and it was commissioned by Sir Henry Clinton of the British Army. So it's a military map from the Revolution. And we use this as our base map. So this, since it was the oldest, we felt like this would be more accurate to the time in 1609, the closest reference point. And also there's a great amount of detail. As you can see, there's wetlands, and it may be tough to tell from here, but quite a few streams. And then you can see close up here is the Spuyten Duyvil area, which Holly talks about. This map is so important because you can see what it was like before that area was drastically changed. And then down here is what we call Throg's Neck now, but you can see they called it Frog's Neck. And there you can see the trees. This is the only map we had that had forests, so it was also important to include that. Next is the U.S. Geological Survey. This was made in 1888 and published in 1891. It was used for construction and engineering purposes, so it's very detailed in a lot of aspects. Detailed streets, a very detailed shoreline. They put a lot of effort into the small islands on the east side of the Bronx. And then very, very articulated streams and wetlands. Here is Egbert Veely's map from 1874. And this was also presumably for planning and development. This map is actually on its side. So the west part of the Bronx is actually on the top part of the map. And Veely did a good job of tracing out the wetlands, so a lot of the streams and their tributaries were very well marked out and then consequently digitized. And then here is Joseph Bien's map from 1893. This was used for civic planning and very detailed wetlands and shoreline. And here's an example of a map that we actually didn't use. It's from 1776, so even older than our first map. But it shows you the difficulties when it comes to georeferencing, which we tried to do with this map, and it turned out to be quite difficult because of the shoreline. There weren't a lot of streets that we could match up with modern day streets. So we unfortunately weren't able to use this beautiful map, but I think it gives a good idea of the process that you have to take to georeference and how sometimes it doesn't always work out or line up. So, and here I've been talking a lot about georeferencing. This is the actual program, ArcGIS, and you can see the red lines are actually the modern shoreline, and then the Skinner and Taylor map is behind it. And it may be tough to see, but there are little points on the map that we aligned with the shoreline, or the points that we picked out, and we call these control points. So recognizable points on the old map that are still around today, or that we could maybe reference to today. So for this map, there are 45 control points, and there's that's within, when we say RMS area, that means it's within a certain amount of meters from where the Bronx is located today. So when we say 100 RMS area, that means that the Skinner and Taylor map is within 100 meters, is geo-referenced within 100 meters of modern-day Bronx. So here's the Welikia map. It's had 44 control points and geo-reference within 20.2 meters of modern-day Bronx. The U.S. Geological Survey, 123 points, and geo-reference within 34 meters. And that's geo-referencing.
Okay, so then the next process is the synthesizing process. So that's when we took all the different features and combined them into one map, which we used the Skinner and Taylor. So for instance, with the shoreline, we combined all the different 6 maps and combined them and decided on which piece of which map we wanted to use as our overarching shoreline. So for instance, if you remembered on the Skinner and Taylor map, that corner, the right corner, wasn't really shown, so we had to find another map that could really add to it so we could find the whole Bronx, so there wasn't just a little piece that was missing. And the process that we used was, in order to picking which feature from which map we wanted to use, was one, how old was the map? So the older the better, in the sense of if we could get a map in the 1700s and see those features, it would be better than a 1900s map that has already been changed by buildings and such. And then the second was how was the map drawn, and at what level was the map drawn, in the sense of, you know, this Skinner and Taylor map is a huge map. It encompasses most of the Bronx, but then the Welikia maps are small sections of the Bronx. So they have really focused in on those particular sections, so the chances of those being accurate are probably higher. And then our third was the RMS error, in which Liz talked about how the meters off it would be. And the 1 and 2 steps that I just talked about were interchangeable in terms of which one we would prioritize. And it just kind of depended on our sense of the Bronx topography and what we felt would be the best. So here's the shoreline. And here's the wetlands. So nice. And then you had the salt and the fresh. So if you opened up the attribute table, you would see the list of which ones were salt and which ones were fresh. And then you have the forest, which only came from one Skinner and Taylor map, so you can see it was plentiful in the middle. And just to repeat again, that blank spot on the upper right-hand side, that's because of what Holly referenced about the expansion of the Bronx, and those older maps didn't really focus on the east side because of the development wasn't there yet. So here's the forest. And here are the streams. So this is just a beautiful picture of all the streams, and I'm just going to go through a progression of how the streams worked, in the sense of adding map upon map upon map of the streams. So here we have, oh, and then these are the ponds, which we had a few ponds here and there throughout the Bronx, which was nice. So here we have the base map of the Bronx, and then you add the Skinner and Taylor rivers, which are nice along the west side, and then you add the Beers map, which are kind of dead end, dead center. Then you add the Bean map, which is more to the right, which was nice to kind of fill that hole. And then you add the USGS, which was probably one of our most important maps because it had really a substantial amount of rivers to the east, which we were lacking. And then you add the Welikia North, then you add the Welikia South. So then you can see all these rivers that we had to compile. And then we had to synthesize them, which goes through the decision process of picking which river we thought was the best. So like, for instance, when you have the Bronx River, well, practically every single map included the Bronx River. So then you had to choose which segment of which map we wanted to prioritize in the sense of which map we were going to keep to have the one Bronx River. So then that's the synthesized process. So that's kind of taking out all the rivers that we felt weren't needed and to take out to get that final picture. So the picking and the choosing and the labeling of which river was going to be primary, what would be secondary, and what would be tertiary in the sense of, you know, the Skinner-Taylor had the Bronx River, so we're going to have that as our primary. The Bean had it as well, but that's just going to be our secondary because we thought it was the second important. And then the third would be the Veely because, you know, it was great, but we thought that the Veely probably wasn't as accurate as that primary Skinner and Taylor. Complicated. And then here's just a rundown of the summary of the features. So the shoreline, about 29,000 acres. 410 river segments. So when we think of the segments, we're not thinking about just one river. We're talking about pieces amongst the rivers. 38 individual ponds, and then about 5,000 acres of wetlands, which total about 17% of the total land area.
All right, so here is our final project, this composite image of all of the features that we synthesized for the Bronx. And this is really our best guess of what the borough could have looked like in about the mid-18th century. And if you'll pardon this hideous jumble of lines, we've gone back and overlaid the Department of City Planning's street grid layer over our historical map. And I'd like to zoom in on Pelham Bay Park to show you some of the differences here. If you look, you can really see how Hunter's Island used to be several islands and has then been filled in all together. And likewise with City and Hart Islands. And then up to the top left of this image, you can see how streets and landfill have covered over what used to be mostly wetlands with quite a few small articulated streams. And of course, as with any project, there are some limitations to the layers we've come up with. The maps that had the highest georeferencing potential tend to be much younger, and therefore they showed increasing land use. So with the maps that were the cleanest and easiest to use, we were losing some of that historical data that we want to preserve. And as we mentioned before, this lack of centrals in the lack of features in Central Bronx due to poor overlap between our source maps. And because there were 3 of us doing georeferencing and digitizing these features, we tried to keep a lot of things consistent so that we'd have the same level of detail among all of the layers that we produced. There's some difference there. The way that I might have traced a feature would probably differ from the way my friends have. And of course, the next steps for this project, this is only the very beginning, will be to look at the features we've identified and to go back and verify those against other historical maps and just to keep whittling it down to the oldest, most accurate versions of everything we found. Thank you very much.